Story 1. The Battle of Karansipes. In 1788, the Habsburgs launched a campaign into Romania, then under Ottoman Turkish control, and made camp near Karansipes. A Hussar cavalry unit went out to scout and met locals who offered alcohol, which the Hussars accepted. Later, an infantry unit also went out to scout and encountered the very drunk Hussars. The infantry asked for some alcohol, and the Hussars refused, leading to a heated argument. During the quarrel, a soldier from the infantry shouted "Turks!" to alarm the others, and a panicked infantryman accidentally fired a shot. The Hussars concluded that the men were Turkish soldiers disguised as allies and attacked. The infantry fled back toward camp, screaming, with the Hussars in pursuit. An artillery commander at camp, awakened by the gunshot, saw a mass of soldiers charging and assumed they were Turks. He ordered cannon fire on the approaching troops, and the rest of the Habsburg army fled in disorder. 2 days later, the Ottoman army arrived, took the strategically important Karansipes Valley, and found between 1,000 and 10,000 dead Habsburg soldiers. The event is widely regarded as the worst friendly fire incident in history. Story 2. This is not just a tactical blunder by a general, it is almost satirical. The Baltic Fleet's journey and eventual destruction in Japan. 1. The fleet was essentially a retirement home for old vessels. Many ships were not military-ready and had to be equipped with cannons and other gear. They were sent to sail 18,000 kilometers from the Baltic Sea to Japan to reinforce the navy. 2. About 12 vessels were damaged while leaving the harbor. Collisions, running aground, and anchor problems. The fleet lost those ships immediately. 3. Because of lack of training at sea, rumors spread that Japanese torpedo boats were waiting outside Norway. The false reports created widespread paranoia. 4. Crews believed they were passing minefields, so ships made random evasive maneuvers to dodge non-existent mines. 5. The lead ship reported being surrounded by 8 Japanese torpedo boats and engaged them. Other ships either fired at unseen targets or the crews lay on deck expecting to sink. The supposed 8 torpedo boats were actually a single Russian fishing boat sent to deliver a message. Several Russian ships were hit by friendly fire. 6. They lost a ship that had mistaken the fishing boat for enemy vessels and hoped to rendezvous with it at the next resupply port. 7. At the first resupply port, some ships decided to carry as much coal as possible, storing coal in sleeping quarters and kitchens. This caused severe respiratory illnesses among the crew and several deaths. 8. Morale was low at the next stop in Africa, so crews bought animals to boost spirits. The available animals included crocodiles and venomous snakes, which escaped their enclosures and roamed the ships. 9. The previously lost ship rejoined the fleet and reported engaging 3 Japanese torpedo boats. Those were actually fishing boats from different countries. Russia had to explain the incidents to those countries. Fortunately, none of the foreign fishing boats had been hit. 10. The fleet reached Japanese waters and sailed with lights out except for the hospital ship. A small boat approached and was mistaken for a Russian fishing boat. It was a Japanese torpedo boat. The fleet was decisively attacked, suffering heavy casualties and many captives in a lopsided defeat. Story 3. General Custer, at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, ignored credible intelligence that a large number of Native Americans had taken positions on nearby high ground. He directed his troops into a natural bowl and was decimated by his enemy. Story 4. General Douglas MacArthur allowed all aircraft at Clark Field in the Philippines to be destroyed on the ground by a Japanese attack, despite having 9 hours advance warning after the attack on Pearl Harbor. He then reversed his plan to hold the islands until minutes before the Japanese waded ashore, which left his men short of ammunition, food, and medicine as they retreated to Bataan. Story 5. A collection of unmitigated pedantry has its nominee for Worst World War I General, Luigi Cadorna. He lost the same battle 11 times. Story 6. At the Battle of the Crater, commanders replaced trained soldiers, who planned to skirt the rim and enter the Confederate lines, with untrained troops led by a drunkard. The leader jumped into the crater, and the troops were slaughtered indiscriminately. Story 7. Stalin ordered Karponos and Budyonny to stay at Kiev in September 1941 and not to withdraw east from the Dnieper, despite being outflanked on both sides. It was a massive waste of lives and resources, costing the Soviets over 700,000 soldiers and leaving almost the entire front open for Axis exploitation from Gomel to Rostov. Runner-up was Percival, who bungled the defense in Malaya. This was especially embarrassing because his surrender negotiations were even recorded on film. Dishonorable mention goes to Italy for entering World War II at all. It was nothing but disasters thereafter. Story 8. Disclaimer. Whoever gave the order to fire the gun mentioned in this response is not a general. In 1951 and 1952, during the Korean War, a North Korean artillery barrage struck the United States ship Wisconsin off the coast of Korea. The United States ship Wisconsin responded with a full broadside at the hill from which the artillery had fired, leveling it completely. Imagine firing an artillery salvo at a distant ship and, absurdly, a rain of Toyota Corollas. Clearly, the person who gave the order to fire made a terrible tactical decision. Story 9. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest is one of the most significant defeats in Roman history. Germanic forces destroyed 3 Roman legions. Bodies are still being found at the site. Story 10. Pickett's charge at Gettysburg against elevated enemy artillery was a pretty ill-advised call as well. Story 11. Major General Sir William George Keith Elphinstone and the 1842 Kabul Retreat, also known as the Massacre of Elphinstone's Army in the Khyber Pass, January 1842. Elphinstone was commander of the British forces garrisoned in Kabul when forces under Akbar Khan initiated a violent, bloody rebellion. Mobs fought street by street, killing anyone associated with the British, including the British envoy, who hid for 2 days and then attempted to escape to the camp disguised as a woman. The surviving forces pulled back to an outer camp that was immediately besieged, with Afghan long-range Jazile shooters firing from nearby heights. Akbar Khan promised Elphinstone safe passage to Jalalabad through the Khyber Pass, a harrowing 90-mile, 140-kilometer journey, along with supplies and an armed escort on condition that the British disarm completely. Akbar Khan was a recent leader of one tribe among many in the region and had only temporary control of allied groups. Elphinstone agreed and ordered the disarmament of all 4,500 of his troops, including Indian sepoys, and of the 12,000 camp followers, which included families, women, children, and tradespeople. On January 6 the column set out. The promised escort and supplies never arrived. The column became disorganized and overly dispersed, and the limited supplies they had were lost or captured, including blankets and food. Soon after they entered the pass the attacks began. Jazile snipers and raiding parties harried the column, killing at will without effective retaliation. Those not killed by gunfire or close combat often died of hypothermia. In a display of collapse in leadership, Elphinstone and his senior officers surrendered to Akbar Khan and his supporters, securing their own safety in exchange for ransom, which left the column leaderless and in shock. The attacks continued while Elphinstone remained a captive. On January 13, an English surgeon, William Britton, arrived at the Jalalabad garrison. He was long reported as the sole survivor to reach the garrison under his own power. He had a severe head wound, apparently caused by a sword and deflected by papers in his hat, and a stab wound to the knee. Several Indian sepoys and other prisoners were later recovered, and some British officers were released after ransoms were paid. A fundraising appeal was launched in London and elsewhere in the colonies. Overall, fewer than 200 people are believed to have returned. Elphinstone died of dysentery in captivity. News reached London in early February like a cannon shot, stunning the empire and making headlines across Europe and in American newspapers. Story 12. The charge of the Light Brigade at the Battle of Balaclava during the Crimean War is among the top 10. About 260 of the brigade's 673 men were killed or wounded, and 475 horses were lost. Total British casualties were about 615. Russian casualties were similar. Story 13. The 1842 retreat from Kabul involved the British Major General George Keith Elphinstone. For a long time, it was believed that only one person survived the retreat. Story 14. The French were defeated at the Battle of Agincourt. They outnumbered the English 3-1, but the French greatly underestimated the range of the English longbow and were decimated by it. All French commanders were either captured or killed. Story 15. Can I give an honorary or perhaps dishonorable mention to the Board of Ordnance in World War II for refusing to acknowledge that the Mark 14 torpedo had major issues? No, it had to be the sailors who were wrong. Hundreds of men and dozens of ships were lost before Admiral King forced them to do something about it. Story 16. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu saw the French forces fight bravely, but the plan was so poorly conceived that the battle was over after the first day. Once the Viet Minh demonstrated the effectiveness of their artillery, the outcome was inevitable. Story 17. Santa Anna, the dictator who had disbanded the Mexican Constitution for Texans, gave his troops a day off in the middle of enemy territory during the War for Texas Independence. His blunder at the Alamo helped Sam Houston raise an army, but his greater mistake was halting his forces without building defenses or maintaining effective patrols, allowing Houston's Texan army to defeat the Mexican army in about 18 minutes. Story 18. In World War I, Enver Pasha sent 100,000 soldiers to a frozen tundra to fight the Russians. He supplied them with only 1,000 shovels to dig trenches in ground that was frozen solid. He sent mostly Turkish soldiers who had never seen snow or frozen ground. He lost nearly all of his horses, artillery, and fuel to the frozen conditions. His forces were defeated by the Russian army during the winter. He blamed the defeat on Armenian populations, which helped trigger the Armenian genocide. He later provided support to groups that were involved in his assassination several years later. His failures contributed to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Story 19. In general, senior commanders deal with strategic issues, while lower commanders deal with individual tactical situations. My choice is the Normandy campaign, with the 1st Schutzstaffel Panzer Division Leibstandard Adolf Hitler and the 12th Schutzstaffel Panzer Division Hitlerjugend held in reserve during the initial June 6, 1944 landings. They did not get a second chance to push the Allies back into the sea. Hitler made the strategic decision to hold them back because he still believed the invasion would occur at Calais, while the division commanders failed to act tactically despite his orders. Story 20. I'll vote for the Battle of Savo Island. An American admiral divided his forces into 3 patrol groups with little or no coordination. The Imperial Japanese Navy squadron had been spotted the day before, but the message was lost somewhere in the command chain. This allowed the Japanese admiral to destroy American ships one by one, leaving the battlefield almost undamaged while the United States Navy suffered several sunk and crippled ships. Story 21. This was not the decision of a single general, but during World War I the Germans quickly realized the conflict would be a war of attrition and would come down to which society could most efficiently use its resources. To feed the population, they decided it was more efficient to devote grain and vegetables directly to people rather than to feed livestock that people would then eat. As a result, they carried out a mass slaughter of pigs and other livestock. They overlooked that pig manure provided critical ingredients for munitions that were not easily obtained from other sources. Story 22. They allowed themselves to be drawn into a trap, as at the Battle of Cannae and the Battle of Lake Trasimene. Story 23. The 12 battles of the Isonzo River in World War I. Attacking in the Alps to cross a river with worse equipment and morale than Austria-Hungary was a disastrous decision by General Luigi Cadorna. What could go wrong? Story 24. For my favorite book, The Encyclopedia of Military History, Grouchy was content to fight an unimaginative and partially successful battle, while the French Empire was crumbling into ruins 10 miles to his west. I may not have quoted it exactly, but Grouchy's failure to keep the Prussians occupied during the Battle of Waterloo ranks right up there. Story 25. In 1783, British General Clinton did not send reinforcements from New York to Yorktown during the American Revolution. Despite repeated, urgent messages warning that British forces would certainly lose if reinforcements were not sent, he never acted. This changed the course of world history. Story 26. Whenever people read Sun Tzu's The Art of War, there is usually a moment when they read a passage and think, duh, this is the most basic and obvious advice ever. How or why is this book considered useful? This thread explains why. Story 27. This was arguably a strategic blunder. Napoleon invaded Russia without worrying about details like feeding his troops, expecting them to live off the land, that is, to take food from the locals. The Russians had seen what happened to a French army on the peninsula, where Wellington moved all the food behind his defenses and forced the French to choose between starving or attacking well-prepared defenses, and they applied the same approach. The Russians stripped or destroyed supplies and housing along the French line of advance during a Russian winter and used cavalry to prevent the French from foraging. Napoleon's grand army of 685,000 entered Russia. He lost 350,000 dead, about 200,000 wounded, and about 100,000 captured, leaving fewer than 35,000 survivors, many starved and frostbitten, limping back across the border. This episode inspired the saying amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics, and is widely regarded as one of the greatest military blunders of all time. Story 28. The Battle of Tsushima was a hilarious blunder by the Russians. Story 29. The invasion of France via the German circumvention of the Maginot Line. A classic example of underestimating your enemy and not being prepared for the future. Second place is Stalingrad, where Hitler sacrificed his entire Eastern Front because of his ego. Story 30. The Battle of Cannae is still studied for how catastrophic it was. Here is a brief history lesson. In 217 before the Common Era, Rome was threatened in the Second Punic War. The Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca had already crushed Roman armies at the Battle of Trebia in 218 before the Common Era, and at the Battle of Lake Trasimene in 217 before the Common Era. Both battles were decisive losses for Rome, and the Republic needed a plan to survive. In 217 before the Common Era, Rome appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus, known to history as Fabius, as dictator to try to save the Republic. Fabius's tactics were deliberate. He refused to give Hannibal the decisive engagement he needed to destroy Rome. Fabius waged a war of attrition that kept Hannibal from forcing a decisive battle. The Fabian strategy, as the plan would be known, helped preserve Rome, but the approach stirred resentment. Many Romans considered constant avoidance un-Roman and demanded a commander willing to fight. After Fabius's term ended, the Senate refused to continue his extraordinary command. In 216 before the Common Era, Rome returned to the consul system and elected two commanders more inclined to face Hannibal directly: Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Livy estimates that the Romans assembled about 40,000 men and 2,400 cavalry. Hannibal seized the supply depot at Cannae, forcing Rome to send the new army to confront him. When both consuls commanded together, they alternated daily control of the army. Varro was known for his eagerness to fight, and Hannibal took advantage of a day when Varro commanded to draw the Romans into battle. The result was a massacre. Hannibal maneuvered his forces to encircle the Roman army and slaughter it nearly to the last man. Contemporary accounts say the Romans were packed so tightly they could not raise their weapons. Varro fled with his bodyguard, while Paulus died on the field with his men. Rome was desperate and sought the favor of the gods. At the same time, Hannibal did not march on Rome. He instead sent terms to the Senate, apparently hoping to intimidate the city into surrender. Historians generally accept that he miscalculated. Rome used the respite to raise new armies and recalled the lessons of Fabius. The new Roman approach relied on smaller, mobile forces to harass Hannibal, target his supply lines, and avoid pitched battles he preferred. Over years of attrition and campaigning, the Roman strategy worked. Hannibal was eventually forced to return to Carthage, and he was finally defeated at the Battle of Zama in 202 before the Common Era, bringing Rome victory in the Second Punic War. Cannae was a turning point for Roman military doctrine. The loss haunted Rome and influenced reforms in command and strategy that helped produce later victories under commanders such as Scipio Africanus. Summary: Cannae has long fascinated generals and is still taught in war colleges around the world. Story 31. A little-known operation called Task Force Baum. I only know of it because my grandfather was killed during it. It was a volunteer mission and he liked action. It cost him his life. Task Force Baum, also known as the Hammelburg Raid, was a secret and controversial World War II task force set up by United States Army General George S. Patton and commanded by Captain Abraham Baum in late March 1945. Baum was ordered to penetrate about 50 miles or 80 kilometers behind German lines to liberate the prisoners of war held at Offlog 13B near Hammelburg. Controversy surrounds the true reasons behind the mission. Most likely it was intended to free Patton's son-in-law, John K. Waters, who had been taken captive in Tunisia in 1943. The mission was a complete failure. Of the roughly 300 men in the task force, 32 were killed in action during the raid and only 35 made it back to Allied-controlled territory. The remainder were taken prisoner. All 57 tanks, jeeps, and other vehicles were lost. Story 32. The Battle of Cajamarca, though massacre may be more appropriate, saw Francisco Pizarro capture the Incan Emperor Atahualpa with 168 men. They were outnumbered by a corps of about 8,000 Incan professional soldiers and by a larger force of some 80,000 gathered outside the town, yet the Spanish killed thousands without suffering a loss. Atahualpa had been on his way to Cuzco after defeating his rival in a civil war and agreed to meet the Spaniards in a diplomatic show of good faith, confident that a small force posed no threat in the heart of his empire. The Spanish laid an ambush and attacked the emperor and his retinue, who were dressed ceremonially and had left the bulk of their fighting force outside Cajamarca after a period of negotiations. The Inca had never encountered firearms, horse cavalry, or metal armor. Spanish arquebus, cannons, and cavalry charges paralyzed the Inca with shock. Before they realized what was happening, the Spanish had slaughtered Atahualpa's litter-bearers and captured the emperor. With their god-king captured and their forces in disarray, Inca resistance collapsed and the Spaniards rode down thousands as they tried to flee. The main force waiting outside Cajamarca did not intervene. This marked the beginning of the fall of the Incan Empire. Francisco Pizarro, like his second cousin Hernán Cortés, was a brutal conqueror who dismantled Incan institutions over about 10 years, ruling through violence and injustice. Story 33. Here's one that deserves to be better known. The Battle of Patay in 1429. It was part of the 100 Years' War, French versus English, with Joan of Arc. The battle took place a few days after the French lifted the siege of Orleans. The French then advanced along the Loire River, recapturing English-held forts at Jargeau and Beaugency, and sought the main English army. Meanwhile, the English were preparing Agincourt-style tactics. A key element was driving stakes into the ground to protect longbowmen from cavalry charges and to slow infantry. Longbowmen were highly trained and specialized troops who were lightly armored and vulnerable in close combat, so protecting them against close fighting was essential. Lack of discipline and poor situational awareness proved their undoing. A stag wandered onto the field while the defensive stakes were only partially in place. The archers shouted at the sight of the stag and shot at it. The commotion attracted French scouts who had been searching for the English. What followed has been described as Agincourt in reverse. The French charged with 180 knights and 1,300 infantry against an English force of about 5,000. The French suffered only 3 dead and about 100 wounded, while over 2,000 English soldiers died. Estimates of total English losses, killed and captured, range from 2,500 to 4,000. The English longbow corps was effectively destroyed. Most of the English survivors were knights who fled, including Sir John Fastolfe, the real-life forerunner of Shakespeare's Falstaff, who lost his reputation in disgrace. All the English commanders on site other than Fastolfe were captured. Strategically, the defeat was far-reaching. It left the English unable to defend their holdings in northern France and opened the way for a major political reversal: the coronation of Charles VII of France at Reims. From that point forward, the English were never able to regain momentum in the 100 Years' War. They could not fully rebuild their longbow corps because it takes years to train skilled longbowmen. Meanwhile, the French tax base increased with the gains of 1429, and the French claimant gained legitimacy in the disputed crown of France. Story 34. Iraq War. The United States unnecessarily spent $1.9 trillion and caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, with no identifiable benefits. Story 35. Halsey committing the whole fleet to chasing empty carriers while the world's largest battleship, together with many other battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers, strode into the landing zone. even though everyone knew it had every intention of doing so but failed to double-check the assumption that it had retreated. Certainly ranks up there. Fortunately for Halsey, the United States' massive superiority and Admiral Kurita's caution made it a footnote rather than a turning point. The Japanese played Halsey like a drum, and only the courage of the destroyer sailors and the airmen saved him. He was rewarded with the greatest naval underdog victory in modern times, in absentia. Japan should have wiped out the landing zone and every ship it encountered. Not something one should count on. Admiral Nimitz made his anger clear with a blunt message. Turkey trots to water. Greetings from the Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet. Action Commander, 3rd Fleet, for information. Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet. Commander, Task Force 77. Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders. The world wonders was not padding. Nimitz was furious. It was a world record blunder. Halsey knew exactly what he meant when he read it. It was a massive blunder, and he damned well knew it in that moment. Story 36. The Battle of Gettysburg was unbelievable. Intense, interesting, vicious, horrible, and in many ways beautiful. It represented a large part of this country's success. I go to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania to look and to watch. Consider the statement of Robert E. Lee, who is no longer popular. He said, "Never fight uphill, my boys. Never fight uphill. That was a big mistake." He lost his great general. Story 37. The Japanese unit that retreated into the swamp, where they were eaten by crocodiles, must be up there. Story 38. The most obvious rule is never to start a land war in Asia. Slightly less well known is this. Never go in against a Sicilian when death is on the line. Story 39. Recently, it was probably the Wagner Group general turning back after an attempted invasion of Moscow. Story 40. The Battle of Tannenberg in World War I is a contender, as the general lost most of his army and his life. The German units involved were able to relocate and fight in the Battle of the Masurian Lakes a few days later, leading to another large Russian defeat. Story 41. Does Hitler's sleeping in until noon on D-Day count as a tactical blunder? Story 42. Someone left this for us. Present. Nice. It looks just like our horse. Should I bring it inside? It would be rude not to. Story 43. This was the hunt for the Kriegsmarine ship Bismarck. The Germans made a radio report just as they could have escaped, but the British sent a whole fleet to sink one ship and took 14 hours, ultimately failing. The wreckage shows signs of scuttling. Story 44. Almost everything Italy did during World War II was a series of bad decisions by Mussolini and his subordinates. Story 45. Chow Chow chained 1,000 of his ships together with his men aboard, and his enemies set the whole fleet on fire. Story 46. Not the worst ever, but I would rank the Battle of Okahazama as pretty bad. Yoshimoto Imagawa, one of the most powerful daimyos of his era, marched with an army of 25,000 men toward the capital to declare himself shogun. He had to pass through a backwater territory called Owari, which had 3,000 soldiers led by a man in his 20s known as the Fool of Owari. He lost. The Imagawa forces were so overconfident that, while camped in the middle of enemy territory, they removed their armor and got drunk. When the Owari forces launched a surprise attack on the camp, Yoshimoto yelled at them to be quiet because he thought it was his own men brawling. He was killed in the attack, and the Imagawa clan was forced out of the region and destroyed soon after. Story 47. Napoleon's decision to invade Russia is a famous example because he was considered unbeatable. Story 48. The Spanish Armada was a massive 1588 naval fleet sent by King Philip II of Spain to invade England, depose Queen Elizabeth I, and restore Catholicism. The invasion failed because of English naval tactics, including fireships and superior gunnery, and severe storms that battered the Spanish fleet as it attempted to return to Spain. The defeat of the Armada marked a turning point, contributing to the decline of Spain and the Habsburg dynasty, the rise of British naval power and colonization, and has been linked by some to deforestation and arid conditions in parts of Spain. Story 49. General Mattis is retiring instead of sticking around to slap the stupid out of Hegseth. Story 50. Crassus's aimless march into Parthia was a serious blunder. It was even worse than when Custer rode into the valley to surround the Native Americans. Story 51. Anyone who decides to chase after a retreating horde of Hunnic horsemen. Story 52. During the final battles of the Osaka campaigns between the Toyotomi and Tokugawa clans, Ieyasu Tokugawa and his army were initially completely routed by the Toyotomi side. Wishing to inform his lord Toyotomi of the victory, a commander returned to Osaka Castle. As his retinue and banner retreated, neighboring allied armies saw the banner, assumed Toyotomi had fallen, and routed. Seeing this shift in morale, Tokugawa rallied his army and made a complete turnabout. He had attempted seppuku a few hours earlier but was prevented by his retainers. Story 53. During the Peninsular Campaign, Major Lennox of the South Essex panicked in the face of a small French patrol and supporting cavalry, which led to the decimation of his troops and nearly caused the loss of a vital bridge just before the Battle of Talavera, jeopardizing the entire British position. Fortunately, his commanding officer, Sir Henry Simmerson, rallied the men and destroyed the bridge with notable support from Lieutenant Gibbons. Story 54. Those who never listened to Vizzini and entered a land war in Asia. Story 55. May I recommend the Lions Led by Donkeys podcast? That's almost entirely their wheelhouse. Most of their episodes examine a battle, commander, or war that was comically inept to varying degrees. Story 56. I will give some attention to South America, which always seems to have been overlooked for much of its history. General John Whitelock commanded the British forces during the second invasion of the River Plate, known as the Second Battle of Buenos Aires. Before he arrived to interfere, the invasion had been going smoothly and had already captured the city of Montevideo. He arrived in Buenos Aires on July 1st and demanded their surrender. The Spanish defenders refused. He waited 3 days for them to change their minds while the colonial troops and militia visibly built defenses to oppose him and his forces. Then he divided his troops into smaller formations and sent them into the city, completely unprepared for the brutal urban combat that followed. After 2 days of intense fighting, the Spanish launched a counterattack and pushed the British back. After signing an armistice, Whitelock withdrew his troops to England, abandoning Montevideo and his supposed wonder troops for no good reason. Credit is due to Liniers and the troops under him. They fought hard and smart and deserved the victory. It is a victory that deserves to be better remembered by the wider world. But Whitelock was overconfident and played right into their hands. Story 57. The Gallipoli Peninsula Invasion. Story 58. Operation Barbarossa. Never before has there been such a loss of life. Story 59. I cannot wait for a YouTuber to make an artificial intelligence video with Microsoft Paint visuals to summarize all these comments. Story 60. It's probably more of a strategic error, but considering the devastating costs, one could argue that the planners behind the October 7th attack gravely miscalculated. They likely calculated that the Israeli response would be bloody, but that global outrage would check Israel. That miscalculation has turned out to be absolutely horrendous. Not sure if they qualify, and maybe it's too soon. Story 61. At the Battle of Poltava in 1709, Charles XII launched a surprise attack on a reinforced Russian camp of 42,000 men. His depleted, poorly equipped force of 17,000 attacked without reconnaissance, attempting to capture the forward redoubts under well-prepared heavy artillery fire. Story 62. Brigadier General Christian de Castries at Dien Bien Phu, Napoleon's Russian campaign. George Armstrong Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Story 63. A misunderstood order from Lord Raglan during the Battle of Balaclava led James Brudenell, Lord Cardigan, to send the Light Brigade on a frontal assault against heavily defended Russian artillery positions, resulting in wholesale slaughter. Story 64. All 800 United States generals will meet tomorrow for a photo op, while the dictatorship of China needs them all dead at the same time to invade Taiwan. Story 65. I would say American Brigadier General William Hull. He may not be the worst, but he is certainly among them. He surrendered Fort Detroit during the War of 1812. Major General Isaac Brock intimidated him with a letter saying, "It is far from my inclination to join in a war of extermination, but you must be aware that the numerous body of Indians who have attached themselves to my troops will be beyond my control the moment the contest commences. Tecumseh, a Shawnee chief, then took his men north of the fort and created a great deal of noise, leading General Hull to believe many warriors surrounded the fort. Fearing a massacre, General Hull surrendered his force of about 2,100 men and the fort's weapons to General Brock, who had about 1,300 men and far fewer regular troops. Story 66. The Battle of Carrhae comes to mind. Marcus Licinius Crassus led between 36,000 and 43,000 Roman soldiers in an invasion of the Parthian Empire, assuming he would win easily because Rome had recently defeated Pontus and Armenia. In the desert, the Roman army faced about 1,000 heavy cataphracts and 9,000 horse archers. Crassus ordered his men to form a hollow square to protect them from being outflanked, but this reduced their maneuverability. The Parthians responded with their horse archers, hammering the Romans with barbed arrows. Every time the Romans pushed them, the horse archers rode away. Crassus eventually ordered his men into a testudo formation and to wait the horse archers out. This made them ineffective in melee. The cataphracts charged, breaking their formations, causing mass panic, and killing many Romans. When the Romans tried to loosen their ranks to repel the cataphracts, the armored Parthians galloped away and the horse archers exploited the openings to score more hits with arrows. Crassus had planned to wait until the horse archers ran out of arrows, but the Parthian commander Serena had a large baggage train with thousands of camels resupplying them. Desperate, Crassus sent his son Publius with 1,300 Gallic cavalry, 500 archers, and 3,840 infantry, 8 cohorts, to drive the horse archers away. The Parthians drew them into a trap, encircled them, and slaughtered them to the last man. Crassus retreated, leaving about 4,000 wounded behind to die. As night fell, 4 cohorts became lost in the dark and were destroyed by the Parthians. Crassus later met Serena to discuss a truce, but a Parthian grabbed Crassus's reins, perhaps to mock him or steady the horse. Violence broke out and Crassus and his officers were killed. Roman losses amounted to about 20,000 dead and 10,000 captured. Parthian losses were minimal. The battle is regarded as one of the worst defeats in Roman history. Story 67. Hannibal Barca did not invade Rome immediately after his victory at the Battle of Cannae. Story 68. I haven't studied this in a while, so forgive me if details are wrong. In the golden age of piracy, a young Henry Morgan gathered hundreds of pirates to sack Panama. It was a large campaign that took months to organize and months to travel. The pirates marched across the land and swamps of what is now Panama, and many died of starvation and disease along the way. Because the force moved slowly, news of the campaign reached Panama City in time to prepare. The defenders drove hundreds of cattle onto the battlefield outside the city, intending to stampede them toward the attackers and trample many pirates. Morgan and his men were riding on horseback and saw the cattle approaching. They fired shots into the air, and the noise so frightened the herd that the animals turned and ran back toward Panama City, trampling the defenders. In the end, the defenders were routed by their own cattle, and Morgan's men won the battle quickly. However, Panama City had already been evacuated, and its treasure, gold, and valuables had been loaded onto a ship and sailed away before the pirates arrived. Because so many pirates had to share the spoils, most received almost nothing. The expedition chiefly humiliated the Spanish and made Henry Morgan a legend in England. Story 69. I agree. There are several other instances with higher casualty rates, but the loss of morale in the moment, in my opinion, warrants including this incident on the list. Story 70. During the First Persian Gulf War, I always wondered how long it took Saddam Hussein to realize it would not go his way. Story 71. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese left the supply silos, fuel tanks, and most of the military base intact and targeted the ships. The United States was able to replace the damaged ships without needing to import new supplies or fuel. Had Japan not attacked, the United States might not have entered World War II when it did. Germany could have held out longer in Europe, and the war's outcome might have been different. Story 72. Come on, just a quick invasion of Afghanistan. It is just a bunch of goat farmers, we have this on lock. Story 73. The two that come to mind are the Germans' failure to finish off the British at Dunkirk and the Japanese failure to destroy the United States carriers at Pearl Harbor. Story 74. They thought they could reach Kiev in 3 days. Now, 3 years later, there have been 1 million losses on Russia's side, and it is not over yet. Possible consequences include Russia falling apart and the loss of Crimea. It was the worst war decision. Story 75. More strategic and political than tactical. General Douglas MacArthur made the decision to push forces toward, and by some accounts across, the Yalu River despite clear warnings from the Chinese that doing so would bring them into the conflict. He had otherwise won the war, but this single blunder cost half the country. Context. MacArthur then asked for permission to use nuclear weapons, but was denied. It is possible he provoked the Chinese intentionally in the expectation that his request would be granted, but there are no official records to support this, only conjecture. Story 76. Napoleon invaded Russia in the middle of winter. This was not as bad as when Hitler attempted the same after Napoleon's failure was already in the history books. Story 77. After the American Civil War, whoever decided to let those idiots live made a grave mistake that still impacts us today. Story 78. The Battle of Cannae between Hannibal and the Romans comes to mind. Story 79. All the idiot generals who thought they would be the ones to conquer Afghanistan, the place where empires go to die. Story 80. Custer went to a battle called Custer's Last Stand. Fucking goof. Story 81. Putin's special 3-day military operation, which was described as not a war. Story 82. Getting involved in a land war in Asia and going in against a Sicilian when death is on the line. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.